Yeah, good morning, everybody. So it's a brand new day under quarantine, and I want to try to finish up our discussion of kinship. Okay, so what are we heading into next? Well, we talked about descent, we talked about kinship and descent, we did unilineal systems, patrilineality and matrilineality, and we did non-unilineal kinship systems. So we're moving today into classifying relatives, kinship terminology. Now, kinship terminology is important because what it means, or what it's going to bring us into, is a discussion of what we're going to call the cultural construction of kinship, because ultimately kinship is a cultural construction. Ultimately, or family is a cultural construction. Um, that means, to me, one of the things that means is that who your family is, who you consider your family, is a matter of culture and not a matter of biology. Biology actually has very little to do with who your family is. And to the extent that biology does have something to do with who's in your family, we attribute cultural meaning. We attribute meaning to those biological facts. So that's sort of what we mean by the cultural construction of kinship. Every position, every role within a family is a culturally defined role with culturally defined rights and responsibilities and so forth. Mother is a not just a relationship but also a social role, and so on. Okay, so that's where we're heading. I'm going to talk about some kinship terminology and even look a little bit about the history of the way that anthropologists considered kinship terminology. So, uh, talking about the cultural construction of kinship, we're going to look at several different things. We're going to talk about how categories of relatives get labeled. We're going to talk about symbolic definition of relatives. We're going to look at terminology that's used to identify relatives. And again, this is all in order to discuss this thing we're calling the cultural construction of kinship. So I just wanted to look at this statement I have at the bottom here. Kinship is a cultural construction. In culture, humans construct categories of relatives and attribute meaning to them. And that goes for both biological and non-biological relatives. We attribute meaning, cultural meaning, to these familial relationships, whether they are biological or not. Okay? There's nothing magic about biology. All right. In fact, this is the way that anthropologists started to talk about kinship. If we went back into the 19th century, into the 1800s, there was a sort of a viewpoint that said that kinship terms were reflective of biological relationships, but in actuality, they are not. There are certain terms, certain kinship terms that do say something about blood ties, make a big deal, right, about blood ties, and are in a sense not ambiguous terms. So I have examples here. Terms like mother and father and sister and brother and son and daughter are not ambiguous terms. They reflect unique biological relationships. And by that, the meaning of unique biological relationships, maybe that's going to become clearer when we get to the next slide here. So other terms don't faithfully reflect these blood ties. They are ambiguous. I don't know if you remember Napoleon Chagnon when he was writing about, his research on the Yanomamo kinship system, he talked about the fact that systems of naming relatives are to some extent ambiguous. He said that in Yanomamo society, people refer to their father by the word for father, but they also refer to their father's brother as father. You understand what I mean? So they call their biological father father, and they call their father's brother father. So the term becomes ambiguous. Okay, so what do we learn by this? We learn that kinship terms are not exclusively about biological relationships. They are really about social relationships and are related to norms and rights and duties and patterns of behavior.